The hum of the fleet was deafening as the massive starships drifted through the vast, empty expanse of space. The Queen's command center aboard the flagship was lit by soft, ambient lights. Inside, her advisors stood in quiet conversation, their voices low, as they worked tirelessly to prepare for the imminent threat. Queen Ariane's fingers drummed restlessly on the armrest of her throne. Her dark eyes stared out through the viewing window, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the mission ahead. She had been taught how to command, how to make decisions from a strategic vantage point, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The human fleet, her fleet, was facing an enemy far more formidable than any they had encountered before. The alien forces were vast, and their technology terrifying. It was no longer just a matter of defending a colony or a small battalion. It was the survival of their entire species. "Your Majesty!" One of her senior advisors, General Stavos, spoke in a measured voice. He stood beside the Queen, scanning the tactical readouts on the large holographic table before them. "The enemy's main fleet is moving in. We don't have much time before they reach our perimeter." Queen Ariane nodded, but the tightness in her chest told a different story. She had known about the threat for weeks now, but knowing and facing the reality were two very different things. She had been born into royalty, trained for diplomacy and governance, but warfare was something foreign to her. She had never led an army into battle, never stood side by side with soldiers on the front lines. The weight of the crown seemed to grow heavier by the second. Her mind drifted to the faces of the soldiers under her command, men and women she had grown to respect, whose loyalty to her was unwavering. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. Since she had first learned about the alien threat, she had always been a ruler of peace, of strategy, but now war was upon them, and she had no idea how to lead them through it. Outside the command center in the corridors of the flagship, a single figure moved through the shadows. Sergeant Caden Mercer had been part of the Queen's personal guard for years, a soldier hardened by battle and sacrifice. He had seen the Queen at her most regal, leading with calm authority during peace talks, but now he was witnessing the cracks in her composure. Caden had always admired the Queen, but he could see the fear in her eyes. It was something he had never seen before, not from her. Caden stood outside the command center, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe as he watched the Queen. He knew what she was feeling, for he had been there too. The fear of the unknown, the weight of responsibility that threatened to crush even the most seasoned warriors. But as much as Caden respected her, he knew that she could not lead her people to victory if she was paralyzed by fear. Someone had to step forward. Without thinking, Caden pushed open the door and walked into the center of the room. The advisors turned to him, but Caden's gaze was fixed on the Queen. His voice was steady as he spoke, loud enough to be heard over the soft chatter of the staff. "Your Majesty," he began, "if I may speak freely." The Queen's gaze flicked to him, and she nodded, though her expression was guarded. "Go ahead, Sergeant Mercer," she replied, her voice soft but carrying the weight of her command. Caden took a step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the floor. The tension in the room seemed to shift as all eyes turned toward him. His uniform was pristine, though it had seen its fair share of battle. He was a soldier, trained to fight, and in moments like this, there was no hesitation. He spoke with conviction, his words flowing as naturally as breathing. "The fleet is strong, Your Majesty, but it needs more than just strategy. It needs a leader who can show them the way, who can lead from the front. The soldiers are waiting for guidance. Your guidance? But they also need someone who isn't afraid to face the enemy, someone who will stand beside them in the thick of battle." There was a pause in the room. General Stavos exchanged a glance with the other advisors, but Caden's eyes remained locked on the Queen. He knew the weight of his words, and he knew what was at stake. This was no longer about titles or politics. This was about the future of humanity. The Queen's face was unreadable as she listened. Caden could see the conflict within her, the part of her that knew the importance of her role, and the part of her that feared the unknown. She was not a warrior, not like him. She was a ruler, and the idea of leading her people into battle was something she had never been prepared for. Hayden took another step forward, his voice lower now, softer but filled with resolve. "I offer myself to you, Your Majesty. I will lead the charge. I will go to the front lines and fight. If I fall, it will be for you, for this fleet, and for the future of humanity. But you must trust me." There was silence in the room as the Queen considered his words. Her hands trembled slightly on the armrests of her throne. Caden could feel the weight of her indecision, the fear that held her captive. It was a fear that he knew well, but it was also a fear that had no place in the heat of battle. Finally, Queen Ariane stood from her throne. The motion was slow, deliberate, but it was clear that she had made a decision. She turned to Caden, her eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. "You would risk your life for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caden nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I would, Your Majesty." For all of us. The Queen's expression softened, but there was still a trace of doubt in her eyes. She had always been surrounded by advisors and generals, all of whom had fought battles in the past. She had never expected that someone like Caden, someone from the ranks, would step forward in such a way. But in that moment, she realized that the strength of leadership did not always come from titles or royal blood. It came from those willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. "Very well," the Queen said, her voice firm and resolute. "You will lead my fleet into battle. And should I survive this day, I will make sure the galaxy knows the name of Caden Mercer, for it will be your bravery that saves us all." Caden bowed low, his pride evident but his focus sharp. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The war had begun, and he would be the one to guide them through it. His heart raced with the realization that he was no longer just a soldier. He was now something greater, a leader in his own right, one who had been called to action when his queen could not. As the Queen turned to her advisors to give the orders to prepare for the battle, Caden stood at attention, waiting for the moment when he would be thrust into the heart of the conflict. It would be a battle like no other, but he was ready. The human fleet was about to face its darkest hour, but Caden Mercer, once a mere soldier, was now the commander of their fate, and he would not fail them. The hum of the command center filled the air, a low buzz of preparation and tension, as Queen Ariane stood at the heart of the human fleet's flagship. It was the calm before the storm. The ship's crew moved with purpose, their faces a mix of determination and fear. The enemy was coming, and every second felt like an eternity. Her advisors rushed around her, finalizing strategies and relaying orders, but the Queen could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on her. She was not a warrior. She had never been trained to lead on the front lines, but now she had no choice. Caden stood by her side, his uniform a symbol of the rank she had granted him in her moment of desperation. Commander Caden Mercer. The title still felt foreign on his tongue, but the responsibility had settled into his chest like an iron weight. He was the one leading the fleet now, the one who would face the enemy at the front. He had always been a soldier, a man who fought when ordered to. But this was different. This wasn't a battle for survival. This was a battle for the future of humanity itself. As he watched the Queen, he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. The same uncertainty he had once felt before stepping into the role he now held. He could sense her fear, the fear of a leader who had never known war like this. She had relied on others to fight for her, to protect her, but now she was depending on him to guide them through the chaos that was about to unfold. The Queen looked at him, her gaze steady but filled with the heavy weight of command. "Commander Mercer," she said softly, her voice strong but tinged with a touch of hesitation. "Are you certain we can win this battle?" Caden met her gaze, his expression calm despite the storm swirling in his chest. I am, he replied simply. We have the strength to fight, Your Majesty. We have the resolve. But more than that, we have the unity of our people. We fight for each other, for humanity. That is something the enemy cannot understand. The Queen nodded, but there was a faint flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the words of the man she had just appointed to such a position of power, but her mind was clouded with the fear of the unknown. The enemy was not just another faction of rebels or pirates they had faced in the past. This was an invasion, an organized, ruthless force that sought to crush them. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a foe whose technology and tactics were unlike anything they had ever encountered. Caden could see the Queen's inner turmoil. She had never fought in a battle herself. She had never stood on the front lines feeling the rush of adrenaline as the enemy advanced, never tasted the bitter fear of knowing that each moment might be her last. But Caden knew that this was her moment. This was the moment when she would become the leader humanity needed her to be, the leader who could inspire her people to fight against impossible odds. The enemy fleet was approaching, its ships massive and foreboding, blocking out the stars as they drew closer. Caden turned his attention back to the map before him, his mind already racing through the battle strategy. It wasn't just about winning the fight. It was about survival. If they lost here, the consequences would be catastrophic. There would be no recovery, no regrouping. They would be wiped out, every colony and every human life lost. The fleet had been assembled, ready for battle. But Caden knew that the real fight was not just about the ships. It was about the people. It was about ensuring that every soldier, every pilot, every crew member on every ship knew that they were not alone, that they fought together as one. He had to inspire them, to make them believe that victory was possible, no matter the odds. The Queen's voice broke through his thoughts. "What is the plan, Commander?" Caden glanced at her and then back at the map. "We will strike first. We have the element of surprise. I've ordered the fleet to move into position. We'll approach their flagship under the cover of our smaller ships. Our goal is to cripple their command structure before they can launch a full assault." "How many ships will we lose?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caden's heart tightened, but he kept his face neutral. "We will lose ships, Your Majesty. That is inevitable, but we will make them pay for every inch of ground they gain. Our people will fight for their lives, for their families, for their future. I promise you, we will not surrender." The Queen looked at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, but she found none. She had seen countless leaders fall into despair when faced with such impossible odds, but Caden, for all his fear and uncertainty, had a fire in his eyes that told her he truly believed they could win. "Very well," she said, her voice steady now, more certain. "Then we fight for humanity." The command center buzzed with activity as the fleet moved into position. The massive ships slid through the void of space, their engines roaring to life as they prepared for the battle that would determine their future. Caden stood at the helm, his mind racing through the plan, but his body was calm. He had always been a soldier, but now he was more than that. He was the commander, the leader of humanity's fight for survival, and he would not let them fall. As the enemy fleet loomed closer, the tension in the command center reached a fever pitch. Caden could hear the whispers of the crew, the anxious murmurs of soldiers and officers alike. But he knew he could not allow fear to rule them. He had to be the rock, the one they could rely on. He turned to face his crew, his voice booming through the room. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "This is it. This is our stand. We fight not just for our survival, but for our future. The enemy is ruthless, but we are human. We have something they can never take from us. Our unity, our will to fight. Together, we will defeat them. Together, we will survive. This battle is ours to win." The room erupted in cheers, a surge of energy and determination spreading through the crew. Caden could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The fear had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something more powerful: hope, and that hope was enough to carry them into the battle. As the fleet closed in on the enemy, Caden felt a sharp pang of unease in his chest. This was no longer just a fight. It was a test of everything they had fought for, everything they had worked for. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but he refused to let it consume him. He had to stay focused, stay sharp. There was no room for doubt now. "Commander," one of the officers called from the communication console, "the enemy fleet is in range. They've detected us." Caden nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Begin the assault," he ordered. "Take them down." The battle began in an instant, a blur of blinding light and chaos as both fleets collided. The sounds of laser fire and explosions filled the air, the void of space becoming a battleground. Caden's fingers flew over the controls, guiding the fleet with precision, watching as the enemy ships fell one by one. His heart raced with every explosion, every victory. But it wasn't enough. He had to keep pushing, had to make sure the Queen's people were safe. The battle raged on, but Caden never wavered. He knew what was at stake. He could feel the weight of every soldier's life resting on his shoulders. He fought not just for survival, but for the future of humanity. And as the enemy began to retreat, their flagship burning in the distance, Caden knew they had won. The battle was over, but the war was far from it. And as he looked to the Queen, standing at the heart of the command center, he saw something new in her eyes: admiration. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the man who had stepped forward when she could not. The battle had been won, but it was Caden who had led them to victory. And as the dust of the battle settled, he knew this was only the beginning. They had survived the first fight, but many more would come. The fleet had won its first battle, but the victory felt hollow. Commander Caden Mercer stood on the bridge of the flagship, his hands resting lightly on the control panel, eyes fixed on the stars outside. The battle had been fierce, and though their enemies had retreated, the cost of victory had been high. Ships were lost, and many lives had been sacrificed. The crew, though victorious, was worn thin, their morale shaken by the sheer brutality of the war they were facing. Caden's mind raced as he reviewed the damage reports. The fleet had suffered losses, but they were not the only ones. The enemy had retreated, but Caden knew that this was only a temporary pause. They would regroup, reorganize, and strike again. There was no time for celebration, no time for rest. The war had only just begun. Behind him, the Queen moved silently into the room. Her steps were quiet, measured, as though she were unsure of her place on the bridge. She had always been a ruler, a figurehead of power and authority. But now, she was a leader in a war she had never expected. Caden could feel her presence behind him, but he did not turn. He could sense the weight of her gaze, the uncertainty that still clung to her. "Commander," the Queen's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "What's our next move?" Caden finally turned to face her. Her face was drawn, tired, her eyes haunted by the aftermath of the battle. She had seen the cost of war now, the lives lost, the devastation. It was one thing to command from a distance, to issue orders from the safety of a palace. It was another to see it all unfold before you, to watch as soldiers fell, as lives were torn apart. "We regroup, Your Majesty," Caden replied, his voice steady but his heart heavy. "We can't afford to let our guard down. The enemy is regrouping as we speak. We'll need to plan our next move carefully." The Queen nodded, though there was a hesitation in her eyes. "And what of the soldiers?" "The morale of the fleet is fragile. They've seen what the enemy is capable of." "How can we inspire them to keep fighting?" Caden's jaw tightened. He knew the Queen's concerns were valid. The soldiers had fought bravely, but the brutality of the war was wearing on them. How could he inspire them to keep going when they had seen so much destruction? so much loss. How could he give them hope when hope seemed so distant? He looked at her, searching her face for the leader he had seen in her before. She had stepped forward when the fleet had needed her most, but now, it seemed that even she was struggling to find the strength to lead. It was the same fear that had gripped her before the battle, the fear of being unable to carry the weight of leadership. "Your Majesty," he said softly, stepping closer to her. "Sometimes the only thing we can do is lead by example. The soldiers need to see that we are not afraid. They need to see that we are willing to fight alongside them, to stand with them no matter the odds." The Queen met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity in his words, the unwavering resolve that had become his hallmark. She had never expected to be in a position like this, to be the one who made decisions that could mean life or death for her people. But Caden, in his quiet strength, had shown her that there was no other choice but to stand firm, to lead with courage. "You're right," she said, after a long pause, "but I have never been a warrior. I have never led from the front, like you have. How can I inspire them when I do not have the strength of experience you do?" Caden stepped back, his expression softening. "You have the strength of heart, Your Majesty. That's what makes you a leader. Your people follow you not because you are the strongest fighter, but because they believe in you. They believe in your vision, in your commitment to them." The Queen looked away, her gaze drifting to the stars outside the window. "I want to be the leader they need, but I am afraid. Afraid that I will fail them. Afraid that I am not enough." Caden's voice was gentle but firm. "You are more than enough, Your Majesty. You have already proven that by standing with your people, by trusting us when the stakes were highest. It is not the title or the strength of the warrior that makes a leader. It is the courage to make the difficult decisions, to stand firm in the face of adversity. You've done that, and you'll do it again." The Queen was silent for a moment, her eyes focused on the distant stars. She could feel the weight of Caden's words, the conviction in his voice. For the first time since the battle had begun, she felt a spark of hope deep within her. She wasn't alone in this. She had Caden, and she had the people who trusted her. That was all she needed to keep fighting. "Thank you, Commander," she said softly. "I will do my best to lead them, just as you've led us." Caden gave her a small nod. "We all lead together, Your Majesty. That's the only way we'll survive." The command center was quiet as Caden turned back to the tactical maps, his mind already working through the next steps. The enemy would not wait, and neither could they. The next battle would come soon enough, and he needed to be ready. But this time, it would be different. This time, he wasn't just leading soldiers, he was leading a people. The stakes were higher than ever, but with the Queen standing beside him, he knew they had a chance. The hours passed and the Queen remained by Caden's side, watching as he made plans, issued orders, and coordinated with the fleet's commanders. She saw the ease with which he moved through the chaos, his focus sharp, his decisions decisive. It was a reminder of why she had named him commander. He had earned it. But despite the clarity of his leadership, she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The enemy was relentless, and they were only getting stronger. It wasn't just the soldiers who were weary, it was everyone. The Queen could see it in their eyes, in the way they moved, in the way they spoke. Fear was beginning to take root, and it would only grow with each passing day. Still, she refused to let it show. She would not let fear define her. Not when her people were depending on her. She had to lead. She had to show them that they could face this challenge together, that they could overcome the darkness that threatened to consume them. The days that followed were a blur of strategy meetings, briefings, and preparations. The fleet moved from one skirmish to the next, each encounter leaving its mark. The enemy was everywhere, and they were not relenting. But Caden remained a constant presence at the helm of the fleet, unwavering and determined. And as the days turned into weeks, the Queen began to change. She had seen the cost of leadership now, the sacrifices that were required, but she had also seen the courage of her people, the strength that came from unity, the power of standing together in the face of overwhelming odds. As the war dragged on, the Queen found herself stepping into the role she had never wanted, but had always needed to embrace. She would lead her people, no matter the cost. And with Caden by her side, she knew that victory was still possible, that humanity had a chance to survive. The final battle had arrived. It was not a battle of triumph or glory, but one for survival. Commander Caden Mercer stood at the helm of the flagship, staring at the vast expanse of space ahead. The stars were distant pinpricks of light, scattered across an ocean of black. The tension within the command center was thick, the air heavy with uncertainty. The enemy was coming, and they were stronger than ever. Caden could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. This was the fight that would determine the fate of humanity. The Queen, her advisors, and the fleet had all placed their trust in him. He had fought beside them, led them through countless battles, but this time felt different. This time, the stakes were higher. The Queen's life, the lives of every soldier, every citizen, everything was on the line. Failure was not an option. He turned to the crew, his face as calm as ever, but inside his mind was racing. He could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty that gripped them. They were all human, after all. They were all afraid, but that fear, Caden knew, could be their greatest strength. Fear could be turned into resolve, into determination, and that was what they needed now more than ever. "Commander," one of the officers said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The enemy fleet has entered our range. We are outnumbered, but we have to make our move now. If we don't, they will overwhelm us." Caden nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Initiate the attack. We strike first. We take the fight to them." His voice was steady, unwavering. He had no choice but to lead. The Queen had placed her trust in him, and he would not let her down. The fleet was ready, and so were the soldiers. He had seen their courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and now it was time to prove that they could win. The order was given, and the fleet moved into position. The ships drifted like shadows against the backdrop of space, their weapons primed and ready. Caden stood at the front of the command center, his hands clenched into fists, his mind focused on the task ahead. The enemy fleet was massive, their ships bristling with weapons and technology far beyond what the humans could match. But they had one advantage. They were united, and their will to survive was stronger than any enemy. Caden glanced over at the Queen, who stood silently beside him. She had been through so much already, and now she had placed her faith in him one last time. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but there was a quiet strength in her gaze. She had found her courage, just as he had found his. Together, they would face this challenge. "Your Majesty," Caden said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "This is our moment. We fight for our future. We fight for humanity." The Queen nodded, her expression firm. "I trust you, Caden. Lead us." With a final glance at her, Caden turned back to the control panel, his mind focused on the battle. He could feel the pulse of the fleet, the rhythm of the warships as they moved in formation. The tension was unbearable, the silence deafening. And then, the first shot was fired. The enemy fleet opened fire with a barrage of energy blasts, their weapons cutting through the darkness like knives. The human ships responded in kind, returning fire with everything they had. The space between the fleets erupted in a storm of light and sound, explosions shaking the very core of the flagship. Caden's heart raced as the battle raged on. This was it, the moment of truth. The enemy's fire was relentless, their ships maneuvering with a precision that sent a chill down Caden's spine. They were skilled, they were powerful, and they were not going to stop. But neither would the humans. Caden's mind raced through the strategy. his eyes darting from one console to another as he issued orders to the fleet. They had to break through, had to find a way to gain the upper hand. "Commander," an officer called, "our left flank is weakening. We need reinforcements or we'll be overrun." Caden didn't hesitate. "Divert all available ships to the left flank. Hold them off as long as possible." The battle was chaotic, the air thick with the sounds of combat. Caden's fingers flew over the controls, adjusting the fleet's positions, coordinating attacks and managing defenses. His mind was a blur of decisions, each one crucial, each one potentially life or death. He had never been more focused, more aware of the weight of the choices he was making. "Commander," another officer reported, "the enemy flagship is approaching. It's closing in on us fast." Caden's eyes narrowed. The enemy flagship was massive, its weapons capable of destroying entire fleets in a single strike. If they didn't stop it, the entire battle would be lost. He couldn't let that happen, not after everything they had fought for. "Target their engines," Caden ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. "We disable their ship. We take them out of the fight." The fleet responded with precision, their weapons lashing out at the enemy flagship. The battle raged around them, but Caden's focus never wavered. The human fleet moved in perfect synchronization, their ships darting through the chaos with a fluidity that defied the odds. And then, with a sharp, decisive strike, the enemy flagship's engines were disabled. The massive ship shuddered, its weapons faltering as it slowed to a crawl. "Now!" Hayden shouted. "Take them down." The human fleet surged forward, firing relentlessly at the disabled enemy flagship. The explosions rocked the massive ship, the light of the blasts casting an eerie glow across the battlefield. The enemy flagship fought back, but it was too late. The human fleet had found its opening, and they took full advantage. The battle was far from over, but the tide had shifted. The human fleet, once on the defensive, was now pushing back. The enemy's ships began to retreat, their fire growing weaker as they struggled to maintain their hold. Caden knew they couldn't let up now. They had to finish the fight. "Keep pressing them," he commanded. "We don't stop until they're gone." The human fleet pressed on, their ships closing in on the retreating enemy. It was a relentless pursuit, a fight to the finish. Caden could see the fear in the enemy's movements, their once confident attacks now growing more desperate as they scrambled to escape. But it was too late. The human fleet was upon them, their weapons cutting through the darkness like a final judgment. The battle continued for hours, but in the end, the humans emerged victorious. The enemy fleet was decimated, their ships drifting lifeless in space. The surviving enemy forces were in disarray, retreating to regroup. But it was clear they had been defeated. The humans had won. Caden stood in the command center, his body exhausted but his mind alert. The battle was over, but the war was far from it. The Queen had watched from her station beside him, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and relief. She had trusted him, and together they had led humanity to victory. "Commander," the Queen said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "we did it." Caden looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "We did, Your Majesty, but it's not over yet. There's still much to be done." The Queen nodded, her face reflecting the weight of what they had just accomplished. They had survived the greatest test of their lives, but the war was far from over. There would be more battles, more struggles, more sacrifices. But they had proven something today. They had proven that humanity could fight, that they could survive. And as long as they had leaders like Caden Mercer by their side, they would continue to fight, continue to survive. And so the war would go on. But for now, the fleet had won. The Queen had led them to victory, and Caden had stood by her side. Together they had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. It was a beginning, not an end. And in the days to come, they would rebuild. They would fight. They would survive. Because humanity had a future, and it was worth fighting for.